Hi, my name is Mick Napier from the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. I'd like to share a couple of thoughts with you, prompted by the Israeli killing of a 12-year-old child in Gaza on Friday, when the demonstrations generally take place against the siege, the wall, the barbaric siege of the Palestinian people in Gaza. So, child killing, the Israeli media are calling it controversial. They're saying what happened is not clear, but of course the whole world knows that Israel killed that child. There's a huge funeral, a huge mourning, outpouring of grief in Gaza, and calls for revenge, and they're perfectly justified. I want to take a look at the long view and to show that the Israeli killing of children is part of a long-term practice. The Israelis deal in full spectrum criminality against the Palestinian people, but I want to focus a little bit on the killing of children. Of course, it's no secret, everyone knows about Deir Yassin, the slaughter of over 100 people in that village. It's now a suburb of Jerusalem. And the man who led the gang into the village and used knives and grenades and slaughtered men, women and a lot of children, and then paraded some adult survivors in trucks around the Jewish area of Jerusalem before taking them to a quarry and killing them. The man who did that later became Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, and he was greatly admired by a British politician, Gordon Brown, who gushed about Menachem Begin in a speech to the Israeli Knesset. So one Prime Minister is involved in knifing and slaughtering and butchering men, women and children. But, you know, the Zionists, the pro-Israel crowd, say, well, that was Menachem Begin, he was a bit of a fascist. Einstein said he was a bit of a Nazi. But, you know, the mainstream Haganah were clean, quite different. But, you know, Ben Gurion, the father of the Israeli state, confided to his diary, his war diary, a real manifesto for terrorism. He said at the place of action, quote unquote, at the place of action, it's not necessary to distinguish between what he called the guilty, people who resisted the Zionists, and the innocent. There's no need to distinguish between the guilty and the innocent in taking cruel and strong reactions. There's somebody who says you go in and kill a lot of people and you don't care whether they're combatants or not. This is clearly terrorism, even in the standard Western, European lexicon, and even in the Israeli lexicon. They like to claim the difference between them. It's a fantasy. The difference is that they don't indiscriminately target civilians, which the record shows that they do. But not just indiscriminate, there is also the cold-blooded. It's quite different. That's a terrible war crime, but even worse is the cold-blooded murder of children. And that's also very clearly in the record of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine since 48. So we looked at 48, looked at Ben Gurion. A couple of months ago we heard a wonderful woman, Samia Halaby, a Palestinian artist, give a talk on her amazing book called Drawing the Kafr Qasim Massacre, where she described how the Israelis slapped a curfew on a village called Kafr Qasim in 56, did not tell the field hands, because they changed the curfew after they had gone to the field, and then when the men, women and children came back, they executed all of them. One officer said to the returning Palestinian field workers, "How are you?" They said, "Fine." And then he said to his soldiers, because one Palestinian survived under the bodies, he said to his soldiers, "Harvest them." And they killed, I think, all but one. So that's the deliberate killing. And one of the soldiers who did the killing later said, "We behaved exactly like the Nazis did to Jews in Eastern Europe." And who can challenge that? But one of the things that prompted me with this little talk was to read also in this amazing book, Tom Suarez's book, State of Terror. Well worth reading, how the Zionist movement was founded on terror, was a terroristic operation before it acquired a state in 48, and the acquisition of state power simply enhanced their ability to maintain a terror regime against the Palestinian people and surrounding Arab peoples as well. And that's what they did. So I was reading in the book just one testimony, but you know, every page is full of something similar. From 67, where an Israeli soldier gave an interview to an Israeli weekly magazine. Ha'olam Hazeh is my best effort at pronunciation. Excuse me. In which he described how they killed all Palestinians who were trying to return across the Jordan River, who had been violently expelled in 67. A huge ethnic cleansing, not as big as 48, 19 years earlier, but a huge ethnic cleansing as well. And after Israel had conquered the West Bank and driven vast numbers of Palestinians over the Jordan River, many of them tried to come back to their land, their orchards, their homes, and so on. His job was to kill them, which is bad enough. In fact, it's pretty bad. But what struck me was his testimony, where he said, "In the morning we searched the area, and by explicit order from the officer on the spot, we shot the living, including those who hid or were wounded, again including the women and children." So here's a bunch of men who every night kill Palestinians trying to return to their homes, and in the morning go and kill the wounded, including wounded children, including children hiding in the bushes. They kill them. And he gives this testimony in the open, albeit years later, and I think we can believe it. But it's not a single event, it's a regular habit. It's something that starts in 48 and before 48 and continues until last Friday. And we know it continues weekly by their slaughter of children, not just medical workers and double amputees and reporters, but also children are killed almost weekly as well in Gaza, joining demonstrations for their legitimate rights to return. So this is I want to show that this is a tradition, a constant practice. It's not an aberration. There's no need to look at it in isolation and say what could have possibly happened, as the Israelis are pretending to do. And maybe one more story, because I went to, the only time I got into Gaza in 2004 was when the resistance in that concentration zone blew a huge hole in the wall between Gaza and Egyptian Rafah, and lots of Palestinians, hundreds of thousands, surged through into Sinai to buy scarce goods. But I went to visit Mr. Samir Al-Hams when I was there, because I'd heard about him. The killing of his daughter took place in 2004. I went in there some years later. And he described, and I made a short film which is technically rubbish, but his testimony is compelling in the film, called The Killing of Iman Al-Hams. Only significant because the conversations among the Israeli soldiers who killed the child were recorded and played on Israeli TV, and they're available, the English language translations available on the net for anyone who cares to check. And when this child is going to school, she's disoriented by a sound bomb. If any of you have heard a sound bomb, you can imagine how a child would be disoriented. And with a satchel and a school uniform, she wandered into this area, 100 yards or so from an Israeli military post, surveillance post. And the officer says, "Kill her." And a soldier says, "It's just a frightened child." And the officer says, "Kill her." And the soldier, I think, tries again, and the officer says, "Look, kill anything in there, even if it's 3 years old." So this officer is ready to kill a 3-year-old child. And he's exonerated by the Israeli army from any unethical conduct. And he was even awarded money for the trauma he sustained, because there was a scandal for a week or two, and he was shaken by being asked to account for killing a child, and he was awarded a huge sum of money by the Israeli authorities. So they were going to kill that child. They killed that child. And that then led me to the testimony of Chris Hedges, an American Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who wrote a thing called Gaza Diary in Harper's Magazine. It's available on the excellent website of the Bint Jbeil refugee camp in Gaza. Chris Hedges' Gaza Diary. It's worth reading, because he says he went one day in Rafah. He was there for a while, but one day he describes how the Israeli soldiers were killing a lot of Palestinian children. And he said he's travelled the world. I can give you the exact quote, but I don't have it handy. He says, "I've travelled the world. I've seen women and children lined up and massacred in Algeria, in Guatemala, and so on." The work for which he was given a Pulitzer Prize as one of the best journalists in the world. But he said, "Never before have I seen children killed for sport, as I saw in Rafah, where the soldiers who are bored insult the kids' mothers and sisters. You know, they use crudities, disgusting language, insults against the women. The kids come out and throw stones, and then Chris Hedges reports, with silencers sometimes, the Israeli soldiers kill the children." Now, I hope I've established that child killing until 2 days ago, from 1948 onwards, is an Israeli way of life. They kill a lot of children, and it's not because of some demonic urge. It's because the settler colonial project aims to remove as many Palestinians as possible from Palestine and replace them with incoming Zionist Jews. So every Palestinian who's pushed over the border, who's not allowed to return, who's killed, who's put in prison, it's not quite as good putting them in prison, but because they still come out into Palestine. But if they can remove any Palestinian by injury, by killing, or by expulsion, it's a small Zionist victory. And there's nothing mysterious about it, nothing uniquely Israeli about it. This was the European way in North America, when people exterminated the native people, and South America, where they exterminated virtually the whole population of the Caribbean and large swathes of Argentina and Brazil and so on. The Brits did it in Australia. They attempted it in New Zealand, but they met with kind of fierce resistance there from a military population. So what Israel's doing is just behaving true to form, like a settler colonial project. I can't help, before talking about how this is relevant to what goes on in Scotland and presumably therefore other areas of the world, I can't help but dwell upon the depths of sadism of the Israelis. And two things struck me in the last little bit of reading I've done. And we know that the Israelis demolish houses of Palestinians as they would never demolish the houses of Jews. But you know, it takes a special kind of mind to demand that a man and his wife demolish their home, or they will incur a swinging fine. And to do it on their wedding day is pretty special. And that's what the Israelis did. They did it this year. The other thing that strikes me about a particular depth of sadism is the story of Abdullah Gnaimat, if I've got that pronunciation right, 21 years old. He was killed by an Israeli jeep in his village. I'm not sure whether it was on the way to his night shift in a local factory or or coming home. But in the small hours of the morning, the Israeli soldiers raided his village, and Abdullah was killed. The jeep flipped over, landed on him, and killed him. The Israelis wouldn't allow medical aid to reach him, and he finally died after hours of agony, and no one being allowed to rescue him. But that's not the story. The story is that almost 3 years later, the Gnaimat family, who'd lost their 21-year-old son, received a bill for damages to the jeep for $28,000. That was this year. So what kind of bureaucratic mind, what kind of deep racist psychology or whatever, I'm not a psychiatrist, but something very damaged makes people do that to a grieving family. Anyway, back to children. I was on trial for 3 years in Glasgow Sheriff Court with Jim Watson, and we were charged with racism because a couple of weeks after Operation Protective Edge, when Israel killed 2,200 Palestinians, 551 children was the figure I read, we had gone into shopping centres in Edinburgh and protested against Dead Sea cosmetics companies who were pillaging Palestinian goods and contributing to the Israeli war machine, and we managed to get them kicked out. Did the same thing in other Glasgow shopping centres. Later succeeded also in Aberdeen, and had earlier actually, the first place had been in Dundee, so we got them removed from these shopping centres. But in one in Glasgow we went into and had a good protest. Braehead shopping centre, they were finally kicked out, but before that the cops moved in and applied the handcuffs and took a couple of us off for a weekend in the cells. It wasn't a complete surprise, but what was a surprise was to be charged with racially aggravated offences. We wondered what it could conceivably be, and then we found out after a few years and a lot of money and highly paid officials of the Scottish Government trying to secure convictions for racism, in my case for the second time. But we learned what the racism amounted to. While we were protesting about Israel's butchery of 551 Palestinian children, we carried a placard. I'll post it on my Facebook in a moment or two, well, when I'm finished. We carried a placard saying this company profits from the occupation of Palestine, and made a blood symbol, because at that time, we read, the morgues were still overflowing in Gaza, and the bodies of small children were being held in ice cream refrigerators. This horror had not yet come to an end. The bodies were not yet cold. But, this highly paid legal official in a Scottish courtroom in the 21st century, he said the following. He said, really, this blood symbol is not about Palestinian children. What you're really doing is alluding to a medieval anti-Jewish blood libel, whereby Christian anti-Semites often preceded their massacres of Jews by saying that the Jews had kidnapped Christian children and were using their blood to make matzos for Jewish religious festivals. Of course, it was a medieval, primitive peasant fantasy, but that's what it was claimed in a Glasgow court we were actually alluding to. Now, you may think that before talking here on YouTube, on Facebook, that I've been smoking something and slipped into you from a parallel universe. This happened. This happened. The sheriff threw out the charge of racism completely. He gave it very short shrift. In the witness box, I said it was preposterous, ludicrous, absurd, and he accepted that. But highly paid Scottish officials are trying to impugn and smear as racist, as quite demented individuals, anyone who challenges and criticises and publicises and wants to stop Israeli mass murder of children, whether it be 2 days ago, 2014, 1967, 1956, or future prime ministers knifing them to death in 1948. So we're up against monstrous crimes. We're trying to publicise them, and then we're trying to bring them to an end. And I'm confident that we will do so. The Labour Party is a case in point. That I'm not in the Labour Party. Some of my friends are. Some of my friends hate it. But it's a major British political party, and for years it was dominated by Tony Blair, Tom Watson and his ilk, who were all rabid friends of Israel, defenders of every Israeli crime, and who joined in the chorus from the media and the pro-Israel crowd around the embassy and the Jewish Chronicle and so on, and to try and intimidate Labour Party members from speaking up for Palestine. It was an intense effort. It was joined in by Friedland at the Guardian. It was joined in by Labour Party Blairites. It was joined in by Tories. Virtually the entire mainstream media joined in. And you could hardly wake up any morning and not hear about Jeremy Corbyn's latest anti-Semitic, racist behaviour. It usually took the form of saying what Jeremy did is just terrible, what so-and-so did is... We were never told what he did. It was just hushed tones used to say that what he did, no evidence presented, what he did was outrageous, and the Labour Party had this terrible problem with anti-Semitism. It was fantasy from beginning to end. It was as absurd as us being charged with medieval blood libel for condemning Israel's recent butchery of 2,200 Palestinians. Fantasy, made up, and attempts to intimidate. But you know, it's in tatters. That eruption in Liverpool at the Labour Party conference, a sea of Palestinian flags, people cheering. I don't know the guy's name, the man on the podium delivering a speech, and the chair quite courteously said, look, I think your time is up. He said, I'm not stopping, it'll take an army to get me off the stage, I'm speaking for the people of Palestine, and the auditorium erupted in support. The passion, the beauty of it, supporting the wounded and violated people of Palestine after the long dark night of Tom Watson's and Tony Blair's and all these rabid supporters of rabid crime. I think we're at a stage now where if we organise, we can really begin to rout the Zionists. They have no popular opinion behind them. Every opinion poll shows that. They have the press, the media, and very powerful allies at the top of society. So look, Israeli child murder is a fact, but if you tried to talk about it, you were an anti-Semite. It was a medieval anti-Semitic trope. No, it wasn't. It wasn't Jews who did it. It was the Israeli army, and the Israeli army has Druze and Bedouin in it, as well as Jews. It's not anti-Semitic in the slightest. Our slogan on a banner is anti-Semitism is a crime, by which we mean, horrible. We oppose it totally. Anti-Zionism is a duty. And I would advocate that slogan be taken up and used. Friends, thanks for listening. I won't detain you any further. Apologies for the technical problem that caused us to cease the live stream. We'll deal with that and return to you to talk about, I think, some other stories that you might want to know about. Okay, that can wait for another day. Thanks very much for listening. Please, wherever you are, join Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign or support us in whatever way you can, sharing our message and taking forward the message that Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, and that will be a liberation for everybody living there and for the whole region. Thanks very much. Good night.